Those who desire to be Jesus' disciples must endeavor to learn Jesus' teachings and ways and imitate him by walking as he walked. 1 John chapter 2, verses 3 through 6 instructs that. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 1 also encourages that concept. One aspect of Jesus' life that must be imitated is the way that Jesus was compassionate. Therefore, we must consider the scriptures that give us insight into the way Jesus was compassionate so that we can then learn how to walk in his footsteps in the way that we show compassion. So let's look at some scriptures that help us to see instances when Jesus had compassion. Let's begin in Mark chapter 1. Mark 1, verses 39 through 42. It tells us, "He went into all of Galilee, preaching in their synagogues and driving out demons. Then a man with leprosy came to him, and on his knees begged him, 'If you are willing, you can make me clean.' Moved with compassion, Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. 'I am willing,' he told him, 'be made clean.' Immediately, the leprosy left him, and he was made clean." We can see Jesus in this text being moved with compassion for this leper. Now, some of the Greek manuscripts, as well as some Bible translations, say that Jesus was moved with indignation instead. There was this strong movement inside of Jesus. When you think about what that is, as this translation and others render it, the idea of moved with compassion. That idea is to have sympathy or pity or sorrow for someone who is experiencing some kind of misfortune and have a desire to relieve the source of suffering. And you put yourself in this situation if you see somebody who is suffering in these kinds of ways as this leper was, and coming and begging to be made clean. Now, throughout Jesus' life, before we come back to this particular example, throughout Jesus' life, we see a pattern that develops. And the pattern is one of seeing the need, being moved with compassion, and then acting to alleviate the source of suffering. Again, seeing a need, being moved with compassion, and then acting to alleviate the source of the suffering. Notice how that plays out here. Jesus saw the suffering of this man. And there's multiple elements that go into the suffering that this man endured. Certainly, he had a serious skin disease called leprosy. But leprosy in that time also made him a social outcast. Go read Leviticus 13 and 14, and you can see the laws concerning somebody who had leprosy. So it wasn't just the physical dynamic of it, it was also the social and relational and such things that added suffering to this man's life. The man recognized that Jesus could change his life and begged Jesus to act. Well, Jesus' compassion for the man then resulted in Jesus doing what he could. He had pity, he had sorrow and mercy on this individual, and did what he could by healing the man, which would have given this man a completely new lease on life. Certainly, again, being physically healed of that physical condition, but then being able and no longer having to be socially isolated from everyone, but instead being able to be with his family and his old neighbors and various ones. This was a whole new lease on life. Jesus did what he could do in alleviating this man's suffering because he had compassion. Well, next, let's go over to the book of Luke, and let's notice in Luke chapter 7. And we'll notice in verses 11 through 17. Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 17. It tells us, afterward, he was on his way to a town called Nain. His disciples and a large crowd were traveling with him. Just as he neared the gate of the town, a dead man was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow. A large crowd from the town was also with her. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said, "Don't weep." Then he came up and touched the open coffin, and the pallbearers stopped. And he said, "Young man, I tell you, get up." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Then fear came over everyone, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people." This report about him went throughout Judea and all the vicinity. So, what we're seeing in this text is that Jesus encountered a funeral procession around the town of Nain. And you can picture the scene and all the people from the town carrying out this dead man, a large crowd from the town at least, and in particular, the dead man's mother. And what we find out as you walk through this text is the procession was for a widow's only son. And Jesus saw the situation and was again moved with compassion for this widow. It's interesting to focus that this particular passage talks about Jesus's compassion on her. Not the dead man, though maybe that was true as well. We don't know all the situations of how he had lived his life and such, but particularly Luke records the compassion that Jesus had for her, for his mother. And there are likely several reasons why, that to help us think about this a little bit deeper. There's the obvious example of just the grief over the death of her son. Certainly, for a parent to lose a child is a deep, deep source of grief. And perhaps it's even increased in this particular text because it was her only son. So there's no other in the family who might be able to give her some comfort. The only child she had was now being carried out to be laid to rest, so to speak. Furthermore, there's some other things in the text that helps us to think about why Jesus had compassion for her. We already see that she had already endured the grief of her husband's death, because it talks about how she's a widow. So she has already had a close death in her family with her husband, and now her only son. But I think there's still more. Since widows would often be financially supported by children in that culture, you can see in 1 Timothy 5, verses 3 through 16, an example of that sort of thing. Now, think about the spot that she may be left in with her husband has passed, and now her only son has passed. How is she going to survive just in a financial sense? Who's going to take care of her in that culture? And so there's a lot of dynamics that are likely going on when Jesus encounters this funeral procession, and Jesus recognizes her pain and was moved with compassion for her. And Jesus then, seeing the need, moved with compassion, then did what he could and he raises her son from the dead. Again, Jesus' compassion is on display. But let's go over to the book of Mark again. This time, we want to go over to Mark, the 6th chapter. And I'd like us to read verses 30 through 44. Mark chapter 6, verses 30 through 44. It says, "The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all that they had done and taught. He said, 'Come away by yourselves to a remote place and rest for a while.' For many people were coming and going, and they didn't even have time to eat. So they went away in the boat by themselves to a remote place. But many saw them leaving and recognized them, and they ran on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. When he went ashore, he saw a large crowd and had compassion on them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples approached him and said, 'This place is deserted, and it is already late. Send them away so that they can go into the surrounding countryside and villages to buy themselves something to eat.' 'You give them something to eat,' he responded. They said to him, 'Should we go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give them something to eat?' He asked them, 'How many loaves do you have?' 'Go and see.' When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he instructed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke the loaves. He kept giving them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Everyone ate and was satisfied. They picked up the 12 baskets full of pieces of bread and fish. Now those who had eaten the loaves were 5,000 men." Although Jesus and his disciples were trying to be alone, and Matthew chapter 14 gives us the added piece in verse 13 in this same context of perhaps they were grieving the death of John the Baptist as well. So you may factor that into all this whole occasion. But they're trying to be alone after being swamped with people. And the people wanted to be near Jesus. And Jesus saw the large crowd of people and had compassion on them. He saw them like sheep without a shepherd. That is, he saw them as people who were in need of guidance, people who were in need of care, people who were in need of protection. As you may think about a sheep that's lost in the wilderness by itself, and it needs that shepherd to care for and to compassionately guide it in the way that it ought to go. Jesus, though, did not just see their condition and then move on without doing anything. Again, think about the pattern that we saw. He sees a need, he's moved with compassion, and he does what he can to fill the need. What Jesus does actually is several things on this occasion. The first thing is Matthew 14, verse 14 shows us that he healed people. In verse 34 of this text that we looked at, we see that he taught people. And, of course, the miraculous feeding of these people, giving them the physical food that they would have needed, verses 35 to 44. So I want you to think about how Jesus showed them compassion on both physical and spiritual ways. Physically, Jesus showed compassion for many needs through his healings and by providing physical food for survival in the deserted place. Over in Mark chapter 8, where there's another miraculous feeding of a multitude, it talks about there in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, Jesus, as he saw the large crowds and they had nothing to eat, he called the disciples and said to them, I have compassion on the crowds because they've already stayed with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way, and some of them have come a long distance. So Jesus was truly concerned about them and their physical well-being, and that's probably the same kind of thing that happened in this particular passage. So physically, there's this great compassion that's shown. Spiritually, we also see Jesus showed compassion by trying to teach the people so they could partake in the bread of life. If you read John's account in John chapter 6, verses 22 through 59, you see again this concept and this miraculous feeding. But then he goes on, he talks about the bread of life, not just physical bread, but how they needed to partake of him, the bread of life, so they could have eternal life. And Jesus was trying to help them to see the greater need that they had. Jesus had compassion for them. He saw a need, had compassion for them, and did what he could to try to fill the need. Well, next, let's go a little bit later in the book of Mark, this time to chapter 9. Mark 9, let's look at verses 14 through 27. When they came to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and scribes disputing with them. When the whole crowd saw him, they were amazed and ran to greet him. He asked them, "What are you arguing with them about?" Someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him down and he foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive it out, but they couldn't." He replied to them, "You unbelieving generation, how long will I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring him to me." So they brought the boy to him. When the spirit saw him, it immediately threw the boy into convulsions. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. "How long has this been happening to him?" Jesus asked his father. "From childhood," he said, "and many times it has thrown him into fire or water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Jesus said to him, "If you can, everything is possible for the one who believes." Immediately the father of the boy cried out, "I do believe. Help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was quickly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." Then it came out shrieking and throwing him into terrible convulsions. The boy became like a corpse, so that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus, taking him by the hand, raised him, and he stood up. As people were upset about Jesus' disciples failing to heal this boy of an evil spirit, the child's father spoke with Jesus about his son, who had been devastated by this spirit. You notice the things that it had done to this boy. It would throw him down and make him convulse, foam at the mouth, grind his teeth, and become rigid. It had even tried to destroy him by throwing him into fire or water. In fact, the spirit caused him even to convulse in front of Jesus. Certainly the pain of both this son and his father was plainly evident. Imagine seeing all of that play out before you. Imagine the scene, and imagine the pain on their faces as you watch your son go through this, or as the child himself goes through these things. And certainly the pain was evident to Jesus, and the Father pleaded for Jesus to have compassion on them. So again, we see a pattern. Jesus saw the need, and he was moved with compassion. And despite others failing to alleviate this need, Jesus addressed it by rebuking the unclean spirit so that it came out of the boy to never enter him again. See the need, moved with compassion, it does what he can to fill the need, to address the need. We see it again in this passage. Let's go on now to Matthew chapter 20, and let's notice verses 29 through 34. It says, "As they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him. There were 2 blind men sitting by the road. When they heard that Jesus was passing by, they cried out, 'Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David.' The crowd demanded that they keep quiet, but they cried out all the more, 'Have mercy on us, Son of David.' Jesus stopped, called them, and said, 'What do you want me to do for you?' 'Lord,' they said to him, 'open our eyes.' Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes. Immediately, they could see, and they followed him." 2 blind men heard a crowd of people passing by and wanted to know what was happening. You can read about this in Luke chapter 18 as well, verses 35 and 36. In fact, one of these was a beggar named Bartimaeus, Mark chapter 10, verse 46. So what I want you to recognize as you read through this text and you put these other accounts of this event into consideration with it, we see their blindness clearly impacted more than just the ability to see and just the ability to experience the world normally. It also impacted the ability to make a living. Again, you're in a time where technological advances were not what they are in many places today. You are also in a place that, it would have been much more difficult for those who were blind to be able to do the kind of work that needed to be done to sustain oneself. And so this had a tremendous impact on their lives in a negative way. And they refused to be quiet. The crowd tried to rebuke them, tried to make them be quiet. They refused to be quiet and continued calling out for Jesus' mercy because they wanted to see. And they trusted that Jesus could make that happen. Mark chapter 10, verses 51 and 52. Jesus, again, was moved with compassion for them, and he did what he could by healing them. Now, I want you to recognize that as we've been talking a lot about these physical healings, and Jesus, who was able to have compassion on somebody in a physical way, and then address the need by a physical healing, I want to recognize that although you cannot work a miracle, you can still learn from and imitate Jesus' compassion by doing whatever you can for others. This pattern can still be true about you. You can see a need, you can be moved with compassion, and you can still do what you can for others. Now, again, what you can do is not a miracle, but what you can do is you can pray for them. What you can do is you can spend time with somebody. What you can do is you can listen to somebody. What you can do is you can serve somebody. What you can do is give to help somebody. and a whole host of other things that as you think about each individual situation, to think about, okay, what can I do to help alleviate the need that I see? And that's following the example, the pattern of Jesus. One more passage for us to consider, and that's in Matthew chapter 9. And I'd like us to look at verses 35 through 38. Matthew 9, verses 35 through 38. It says, Jesus continued going around to all the towns and villages, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the good news of the kingdom, and healing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he felt compassion for them, because they were distressed and dejected like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is abundant, but the workers are few. Therefore pray to the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest." Jesus saw the needs of people while he walked on this earth. Now that just of itself needs thought about for a little while. Jesus saw the needs of people while he walked this earth. Do you see the needs of people while you walk this earth? Or are you oblivious to people around you and you're just focused on yourself? Jesus saw those needs, and he was moved with compassion for those who lived in this world and were devastated by sin's effects. Even if you recognize the needs of other people, are you moved with compassion? Are you moved with compassion for people who are suffering due to sin's effects on this world? This certainly included compassion for those dealing with the pain and suffering and death brought into this world through sin. But his greatest demonstration of compassion concerned the spiritual lostness of this world due to sin, those who had earned the wages of sin, which is spiritual death, Romans 6 and verse 23. But the gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus our Lord. Jesus saw this spiritual need, this spiritual lostness, as the greatest need people had, and came to seek and save the lost, Luke chapter 19, verse 10, teaching the good news of God's kingdom and providing himself as the sacrifice to set people free from sin and bring them to God. John 8, verses 31 and 32 talks about knowing the truth, and the truth will make you free. John 14, verses 1 through 6, Jesus taught how he is the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through him. Jesus provided that opportunity for everyone. You know, sometimes it is that we may see the pain of other people as it relates to physical things, and then we seem to be oblivious to their spiritual needs. Jesus saw the physical needs, but he also saw the spiritual needs. And ultimately, what he had come to address was the spiritual need. Not just of the people in that geographic region during the time he walked this earth, but the spiritual needs of all people everywhere who would come to him. So as Jesus walked the earth, he could see the needs of the people for what they truly were. That people were living, again, like sheep in need of a shepherd. And he became that shepherd for those interested in following his voice. John chapter 10, verses 1 through 30. You can read that section about Jesus as the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. Now, that's his compassion. People would no longer have to struggle in the desert of sorrow and sin, but they could come to him and they could find rest for their souls. Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30. And then you notice in this text that Jesus' instructions also pointed his disciples to have this spiritually focused compassion on others as well, praying that God would send workers into the harvest of lost souls in this world, and implying that his disciples should also be doing what they can to help point people to Jesus and out of their lost condition. And certainly Jesus, as he prepared to ascend to heaven, left the instructions for his disciples to go into all the world and preach the gospel and make disciples of all nations. Matthew 28, verses 18 through 20. Certainly Jesus' followers who know the spiritual devastation of sin, because we've been there, and who know the solution to it through Jesus, should be moved with compassion and do what we can to help the lost escape their lostness, to snatch people from the fire. Jude 1, verses 22 and 23. 2 Timothy 2, verses 24 through 26, talking about people who have been ensnared by Satan. We want to help rescue them from Satan's snares. Jesus, again, even with spiritual needs, saw the need, was moved with compassion, and did what he could to help alleviate the need. How about you? And how about me? We need to do the same thing. We need to be compassionate like Jesus. As we close this study, we see that imitating Jesus requires that you be compassionate like Jesus demonstrated compassion. Although there is much more that could be discussed, we have seen Jesus' compassion being shown in different ways throughout his earthly life. Ultimately, Jesus demonstrated his compassion through his willingness to provide the only sacrifice that could bring about salvation from sin. Therefore, disciples of Jesus must learn to have compassion on the physical and spiritual needs of others that results in doing whatever is possible to alleviate them.